Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In the heart of Canada lies a province unlike any other, Quebec, a place where the streets echo with French instead of English, where the culture, politics, and identity feel distinct, even defiant. It's a province with a powerful sense of nationhood, shaped by centuries of history as New France, British conquest, and the ongoing struggle to protect its language and culture in an overwhelmingly English-speaking country. But twice in living memory, Quebec came closer than any other Canadian province to breaking away entirely. In 1980 and again in 1995, the people of Quebec were asked a historic question: should they become an independent country? Both times the answer sent shockwaves through Canada and nearly redrew the map forever. This is the story of identity, power, and political brinkmanship. Why did Quebec want to leave? And just as importantly, why didn't it? Quebec's path to a distinct identity begins long before modern Canada was even born. In the early 1600s, France established a foothold in North America, New France, with Quebec as its cultural and political heart. French language, Catholic faith, and a deeply rooted civil legal system defined this early colony. But everything changed in 1759, when British forces defeated the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, a turning point that led to France ceding its North American territories. By 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, New France became a British possession. But rather than erase French culture, the British made a calculated move. With the Quebec Act of 1774, they allowed the French-speaking population to retain their language, religion, and legal traditions. This was a strategic attempt to keep the colony loyal during the American Revolution, but it also had lasting consequences. It cemented Quebec's unique status within what would eventually become Canada. Over time, Quebec developed alongside, but apart from the rest of Canada. Its Catholic roots stood in contrast to the Protestant English majority. Its use of the civil law system inherited from France differed sharply from the common law system used elsewhere in Canada. And above all, the French language remained a defining feature of life in the province. These cultural and institutional differences laid the groundwork for a strong sense of French-Canadian nationalism, a belief that the people of Quebec were not just a linguistic minority, but a distinct nation within a nation. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, this identity only grew stronger, fueled by waves of political activism, calls for autonomy, and a desire to protect Quebec's heritage from the pressures of assimilation. By the time Canada officially became a confederation in 1867, Quebec was already carving out a parallel identity, not merely as one province among many, but as a nation within a federation, setting the stage for future conflicts over sovereignty, recognition, and independence. The 1960s marked a turning point in Quebec's history, a period known as the Quiet Revolution. It wasn't marked by violence or upheaval, but by sweeping and rapid social change that transformed nearly every aspect of Quebec society. The Catholic Church, once the cornerstone of public life in Quebec, saw its grip on education, healthcare, and politics dissolve almost overnight. In its place rose a new vision, a secular, modern, and economically ambitious Quebec. This revolution was about more than policy reform. It was about identity. French-speaking Quebecers, long treated as second-class citizens in their own province, began to demand more than just cultural protection. They wanted power. Economic nationalism surged, with calls to maîtres chez nous, masters in our own house. The goal was clear: Quebec should control its own future, not just culturally or economically, but politically. Out of this wave of change emerged a bold new political force, the Parti Québécois, PQ, founded in 1968 by journalist and former Liberal cabinet minister René Lévesque. Unlike earlier movements, the PQ didn't just advocate for reforms, it sought full sovereignty. The party called for Quebec to become an independent nation, while maintaining economic ties with the rest of Canada. As the Parti Québécois, PQ, gained traction in the late 1960s and 1970s, it became more than just a political party. It became a symbol of a rising tide of Quebec nationalism that was no longer content with cultural preservation alone. This was a movement that now envisioned political independence as the only true path to self-determination. At the heart of this growing tension was a fundamental conflict between two competing ideas of what Canada should be. On one side stood the Canadian federal government, led by figures like Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who championed a vision of national unity based on bilingualism and multiculturalism. In this model, Canada wasn't just a bilingual country, it was a country where all cultures were meant to coexist and thrive equally. Policies were introduced to promote French across Canada, and federal institutions became officially bilingual. But to many Quebecois nationalists, these federal reforms felt performative and inadequate. Bilingualism in places like British Columbia or Alberta didn't erase the everyday experience of being a minority within their own country, nor did it address their desire for control over their own laws, economy, and international relations. Quebec's French-speaking population, despite living in a province where they were the majority, still felt culturally marginalized and politically constrained by decisions made in Ottawa. The concept of multiculturalism, meanwhile, was viewed by many in Quebec not as inclusive, but as a dilution of their unique identity. Unlike immigrant communities that brought their cultures to Canada, French-speaking Quebecers saw themselves as a founding people with a centuries-long history on the continent. They weren't just another group in a cultural mosaic. They were, in their view, a nation within a nation. By the late 1970s, these competing visions became impossible to reconcile peacefully through minor reforms. The Federalist dream of a united, bilingual, multicultural Canada clashed directly with the sovereigntist vision of an independent Quebec, free to define its own future. It was no longer just about language or religion, it was about power, identity, and survival. The Quiet Revolution had lit the fuse. And with the Parti Québécois winning the provincial election in 1976, the next step was clear. They would ask the people of Quebec, in a referendum, whether they wanted to begin the process of breaking away from Canada. What followed would challenge the unity of the country like never before and set the stage for decades of national debate, fear, and transformation. In 1976, the Parti Québécois, PQ, led by René Lévesque, shocked the nation by winning the provincial election. For the first time, a party explicitly committed to Quebec sovereignty held power. Lévesque promised not to declare independence unilaterally, but to hold a referendum, giving Quebecers the final say. That moment came in 1980. The question wasn't framed as a simple break from Canada. Instead, the PQ proposed a model of sovereignty association. Quebec would become politically independent, but maintain close economic ties with Canada, including a shared currency and open borders. To many, it seemed like a way to have both independence and security, but the stakes were enormous. The federal government, under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, campaigned fiercely against the proposal. Trudeau, a Montreal-born federalist and charismatic speaker, argued that separation would isolate Quebec, weaken Canada, and risk serious economic fallout. He portrayed the referendum as a gamble with Quebec's future. The campaign turned into a battle of two powerful visions and two compelling leaders. Lévesque appealed to Quebec pride, the dream of finally being masters of their own fate. Trudeau countered with a vision of renewal, promising constitutional reforms that would better reflect Quebec's role in Canada, if only voters would reject sovereignty. On May 20, 1980, Quebecers voted. The result? 60% voted no, rejecting the proposal. It was a clear, though not overwhelming, decision to stay within Canada. Why did Quebecers say no? Many were hesitant to take such a dramatic leap into the unknown. The promise of economic association felt vague, and the risks, financial instability, international uncertainty, were real. Others were swayed by Trudeau's last-minute promise that if Quebec stayed, he would lead efforts to renew the Canadian Constitution and ensure Quebec's distinctiveness was recognized. The result didn't end the sovereignty movement, but it did change the conversation. Instead of breaking apart, Canada now turned toward a period of constitutional upheaval as Trudeau set out to fulfill his promise and redefine the federation. The question was, would it be enough to keep Quebec satisfied? After the 1980 referendum defeat, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau moved quickly to fulfill his promise of constitutional renewal. His goal was to give Canada full legal independence from Britain by patriating the Constitution, bringing it home to Canada, and to enshrine a new charter of rights and freedoms that would define the country's democratic values. But the process soon deepened the divide between Quebec and the rest of Canada. In 1982, the Constitution Act was signed into law without the consent of Quebec's provincial government. René Lévesque, still premier at the time, felt betrayed. During a pivotal late-night negotiation session, often referred to as the Night of the Long Knives, Lévesque was left out of a key deal struck between the federal government and the other provinces. As a result, Quebec became the only province not to sign the new constitution, a fact that remains symbolically and politically significant to this day. This exclusion fed a growing sense of alienation in Quebec. Many saw it as proof that Quebec's unique identity and aspirations were not truly respected within the Canadian Federation. For years, federal governments tried to repair the damage. The Meech Lake Accord, 1987-1990, was the first serious attempt. It proposed recognizing Quebec as a distinct society and granting more provincial powers. Initially supported by all provinces, it unraveled due to political opposition in places like Manitoba and Newfoundland. The accord collapsed just before its deadline in 1990, triggering anger and disillusionment in Quebec, where it was seen as yet another rejection. 2 years later came the Charlottetown Accord, 1992, a broader constitutional package that included Indigenous self-government and Senate reform alongside Quebec recognition. But this time, a national referendum was held, and the accord was rejected not only in English Canada, but also in Quebec. People on both sides felt the deal gave away too much, or not enough. These repeated failures hardened feelings in Quebec. The message to many Quebecers was clear: Canada would not or could not accommodate their aspirations. What had begun as a promise of inclusion after the 1980 referendum had now morphed into a decade of constitutional crisis, missed opportunities, and deepening mistrust. And with emotions running high, the stage was set for a second, even more dramatic referendum. In 1994, the Parti Quebecois returned to power under Jacques Parizeau, reigniting the dream of Quebec sovereignty. Just a year later, in 1995, the province prepared for a second referendum, but this time, the mood was even more intense, the stakes higher, and the country more polarized than ever before. Unlike the 1980 referendum, which proposed sovereignty association, the 1995 question was more direct. Should Quebec become sovereign after offering Canada a new economic and political partnership? The Federalist side warned this was essentially a step toward full independence. The Sovereigntists, led by Parizeau and supported by charismatic Bloc Québécois leader Lucien Bouchard, framed it as Quebec's last chance to claim its rightful place as a nation. What followed was one of the most emotionally charged political campaigns in Canadian history. Across Quebec, families, friends, and co-workers found themselves on opposite sides of a deeply personal debate about identity, future, and belonging. For many Quebecois, voting yes meant embracing their heritage and securing self-determination. For others, voting no meant staying within Canada, flawed though it might be, and avoiding uncertainty and division. The federal government, led by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, launched a passionate campaign to keep the country united. In the final days before the vote, tens of thousands of Canadians gathered in Montreal for a massive unity rally, waving Canadian flags and pleading for Quebec to stay. On October 30th, 1995, the province voted. The results stunned the nation. 49.42% voted yes to sovereignty, and 50.58% voted no. The margin was a razor-thin less than 1%, a difference of just over 54,000 votes. Canada had come closer than ever to breaking apart. The aftermath was filled with shock, relief, and bitterness. In his concession speech, Parizeau stirred controversy by blaming the defeat on money and the ethnic vote, a statement widely condemned as divisive and discriminatory. The remark exposed undercurrents of resentment and exclusion, particularly toward immigrant communities who had largely voted no. The close result sent shockwaves through Canada. It prompted the federal government to pass the Clarity Act in 2000, setting strict conditions for any future secession attempt. In Quebec, however, the legacy of 1995 remained potent. For many, it was proof that their dream of independence was real and achievable. For others, it was a painful reminder of just how fragile Canadian unity could be. The 1995 referendum wasn't just a political event, It was a moment when a nation stood on the edge of division, and when millions were forced to confront profound questions about who they were and what kind of country they wanted to live in. In the wake of the razor-thin result of the 1995 referendum, the federal government moved swiftly to address a troubling reality. Canada had nearly broken apart, and there were no clear legal rules in place for how such a separation would or could happen. The chaos and ambiguity surrounding the referendum's process and aftermath raised a crucial question. What would actually happen if a province voted to leave? To answer that, the issue was brought before the Supreme Court of Canada. In 1998, the court delivered a landmark decision. Unilateral secession by a province was not legal under either Canadian or international law. However, the ruling also said that if a clear majority of Quebecers voted yes on a clear question, the federal government would have a constitutional obligation to negotiate the terms of separation in good faith. Building on this decision, the federal government passed the Clarity Act in 2000. This law established formal guidelines for any future secession attempt. It gave the House of Commons the power to decide whether a proposed referendum question was sufficiently clear and whether the resulting majority was strong enough to justify negotiations. The goal was to prevent confusion, vague wording, or manipulation of the democratic process, as many felt had occurred in 1995. The Clarity Act was deeply controversial in Quebec, while Federalists viewed it as a necessary safeguard for Canadian unity. Many sovereigntists saw it as an attempt to undermine Quebec's right to self-determination. The provincial government responded with its own legislation, Bill 99, affirming Quebec's belief that only Quebecers had the right to decide their future. Since then, the momentum for another referendum has waned, but the debate over Quebec's place in Canada continues. Younger generations have different priorities, but the questions raised by the referendums of 1980 and 1995 still echo. What is Quebec's identity? What does it mean to be Canadian? And can a country so diverse truly remain united? Though Quebec remains part of Canada, the Clarity Act symbolizes an uneasy peace, a legal truce in a nation still wrestling with its identity. Today, Quebec nationalism looks very different than it did in the fervent days of the 1980 and 1995 referendums. Separatist sentiment has declined, especially among younger Quebecers who have grown up in a Canada that is more inclusive, bilingual, and interconnected than ever before. While the idea of Quebec independence still holds symbolic power for some, polls consistently show lower support for secession compared to past decades. One major reason for this shift is economic and cultural integration. Quebec is deeply tied to the rest of Canada through trade, federal programs, and shared institutions. The costs and uncertainties of independence, especially in a globalized world, now weigh heavily in public opinion. Additionally, many Quebecers have come to see their unique identity as something that can thrive within Canada, rather than requiring full separation from it. That said, the nationalist movement is not dead, it's dormant. Political parties like the Parti Quebecois and Québec Solidaire still advocate for sovereignty, though with less intensity. Instead of demanding immediate separation, modern Quebec nationalism often focuses on protecting French language laws, defending provincial autonomy, and promoting cultural preservation. At the same time, tensions remain. Debates over immigration, secularism, and identity surface regularly in Quebec politics. And as Canada continues to evolve demographically and politically, the question of Quebec's future could resurface under different circumstances. So, is the dream of independence over? For now, it seems to be on pause, replaced by a more pragmatic approach. But the emotional core of the movement, the desire for recognition, control, and cultural pride, still pulses beneath the surface. In a country shaped by compromise and contradiction, Quebec's story is far from finished. As we've seen, Quebec's journey towards sovereignty has been a complex and emotional one, with narrow margins that nearly changed the course of Canadian history forever. From the battles of the Quiet Revolution to the high-stakes referendums of 1980 and 1995, Quebec's quest for identity and independence has shaped not just the province, but the entire nation. So, what do you think? Do you believe Quebec will ever leave Canada? Why or why not? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's pivotal moments.